Hello, class. Today we are going to sort of finish our review portion of the course and take a look at one of the body systems, the endocrine system, and how it responds to resistance training. A lot of the adaptations that we're going to see down the road in this class are driven by the response of the endocrine system based upon whatever type of activity that you're participating in. Okay, in particular, we're going to focus mostly on resistance training in this particular chapter. Okay, so just a couple key terms to remind you of. First of all, a hormone. What is it? It's sort of the method of delivery that the endocrine system uses. So it's a chemical messenger that is typically made in a specific gland in the body. Okay, and it's often stored in that same gland, although not always. And then under certain conditions, that hormone is released into circulation, into the blood, where it has a target cell. Okay, so the next term there, the endocrine glands, specialized body structures that are designed to synthesize, store, and release these individual hormones. So we see a few of the principal ones really that are important for exercise on this slide here. So the hypothalamus, located in the brain, contains attached to it the pituitary gland, both the anterior and the posterior. The anterior pituitary gland in particular is very important, driving really natural human growth and also growth that might be mediated by exercise and the response to exercise as well. Okay. The thyroid gland, of course, is a gland that really helps regulate metabolism, so it can, if it's functioning well, when thyroid hormone is released, it can accelerate metabolism, and often if someone has a damaged thyroid gland, their metabolic rate is reduced, and that could then lead to some complications, one of which might be weight gain. Okay. The adrenal glands are very, very important because they release our stress hormones. Okay, so we have sort of our fast-acting ones, which just accelerate activity during the by stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. And then we also have our longer-term, slower-acting stress hormones, in particular cortisol, which has a very important role during exercise. And also, if there is dysfunction with the adrenal glands and cortisol is elevated chronically, that can lead to a lot of health difficulties. Okay. And then lastly here, we have the pancreas, which releases both insulin and glucagon, but insulin is typically the one that we associate with it, which helps us to store sugar, glucose into our cells. When the pancreas is dysfunctional, insulin levels can be negatively affected, and that could lead to issues kind of related to diabetes. Okay, so that's kind of a good overall view. We're going to pick out a couple of these and really stick to some specific hormones that are important during exercise performance. Okay, before we get to those though, let's just kind of again stick with this general review of the system. Okay. So one of the most important roles that hormones will have is their effect on proteins in general, but the two processes that are sort of like the yin and yang, you have either protein synthesis, which is stimulating growth. Okay, some hormones will facilitate protein synthesis. Others will have a what we call a catabolic effect, which is the degradation or the breaking down of proteins. Okay, the one that is the most commonly associated with that is the one that I mentioned a second ago, which is cortisol. Okay, so cortisol causes muscle protein catabolism or degradation during exercise. Okay, and then there are other hormones, particularly testosterone, insulin, growth hormone. They all sort of have a permissive effect or a stimulatory effect to increase protein synthesis. Okay, so much like life, right? There is this balance that is very delicate that we want to maintain. Okay, And if something due to a disease process gets thrown greatly out of balance, then we could have issues. So a good example of that is what I mentioned a second ago with regards to cortisol, right? Cortisol is released in response to stress. Ideally in life, we're not chronically stressed, always stressed. We should have a balance between stress and lack of stress, or stress management. But if we're always stressed all the time, then cortisol levels are going to be elevated, and that balance is going to be thrown off, and our body's going to be in an environment where the catabolism of protein is going to be the dominant force, and not only will you not be able to gain muscle mass, but you'll start to lose existing muscle mass. Okay, so cortisol can sort of bring us to this state where we have like muscle wasting occurring. Okay, so that's why, you know, stress management is a very, very important concept to practice in your life, because you want to make sure that that's going to assist in keeping your proteins your hormones in this state of balance that we should hope to achieve in life for proper health. So just to review a little further how the hormones interact. Now I mentioned that there's always a target tissue, right? Our body just releases hormones into the blood, okay? So it's like a general release from there. They're going to pass by many different, interrupted there. I'm going to just kind of start this over. But it's important to note that hormones will only interact with certain tissues, and that tissue is the target tissue. Okay, so often hormones have these certain key. They kind of are like a certain key, and that key will only fit into a certain lock, right? So this hormone could be traveling through the blood, and it would pass by these receptors, and there would be no effect. But if it came upon this receptor, it would lock in, for lack of a better word, and it could then bring about the change or the cascade of changes that would occur. Okay, so again, why is that important? And it's because hormones are released into general circulation, right? So they're traveling throughout our blood, and they're not going to just go to one location. They could travel throughout the whole body. However, as they're passing through the body, when they pass by a receptor that they are coded for or keyed to, they will interact there, right? So one thing that can influence the effect a hormone could have is how many receptors are available, right? So when we get to testosterone here in a second, we will see the influence of the number of receptors can have and the effect it can have on how much the hormone is able to interact with the cell. Okay. So lastly, then, there are a few different classes of hormones that we're going to run through before we get into some specific hormones. Okay. So one type of hormone is known as a steroid hormone. Think of a steroid hormone as one that is largely made of cholesterol. Okay. And because it is made of fat, it is what we call fat soluble. Okay, so if something is fat soluble, that means it can pass through other fat molecules. Okay, so as you should remember, our cell membranes are largely made of fatty molecules. Okay, call it the lipid membrane. Okay, a fat soluble hormone, then, such as a steroid hormone, can pass directly through that membrane because fat can travel through fat. Okay, so there are not receptors located on the outside of a cell that steroid hormones interact with. Instead, the receptors for steroid hormones are found usually within the cell. Okay, and that is important because the hormone can pass into the cell freely, where it can then find its receptor, again, that's going to be located inside the cell. Okay, so our hormone that I've mentioned a few times in this lecture so far already, testosterone, is a good example of a steroid hormone. So the receptors for testosterone are going to be inside the cell, not on the cell membrane, because that particular hormone can pass through the cell membrane because it is fat soluble. You got it. Now, another class of hormone is known as a polypeptide hormone. So these hormones are largely made of amino acids. Amino acids cannot pass freely through the cell membrane. Therefore, they have to interact on the cell membrane. So with this particular type of hormone, or class of hormones, there is a receptor located on the cell membrane. And when the hormone interacts with the receptor, it then basically initiates what we call a cascade, or a series of events within the cell to occur that will then bring about the desired effect. Okay, so you might use the phrase they use here. There's an external receptor. Okay, and once that external receptor is activated, there is what we call a secondary messenger system that is activated within the cell. And I guess here they abbreviate that as the STAT, the STAT. And you see that over here. Once the hormone binds to the external receptor, the secondary messenger system is activated, and that then brings about the change initiated by the hormone. Okay, so two examples of these types of hormones are growth hormone and insulin. We will come back and talk about these two specifically here in just a little bit. Okay, then we have our last class of hormones, and these are known as the amine hormones. These are also synthesized from amino acids. They function in very much the same way, in that they bind to the cell membrane at an external receptor, and they then activate a secondary messenger system. Okay, major amine hormones are epinephrine, and we're going to talk about that one again later as well. The key point here is says this is not regulated by negative feedback, and what that basically means is as long as these hormones are present, they're going to still be making changes. Where the other hormones, they are regulated by negative feedback, which means once the concentration of that hormone rises in the blood, its release will be inhibited. Okay, that's what negative feedback how negative feedback operates. With these, on the other hand, the concentration can keep rising, and the hormone will still be being released as long as the stimulus that causes the release of the hormone is promoting its release. In this case, epinephrine is a primary stress hormone. As long as we're feeling stress, epinephrine will be released until that stressor is removed. Okay, an effect of epinephrine, and you might hear epinephrine referred to as adrenaline. Epinephrine will cause things like elevated heart rate, elevated breathing rate, sweaty hands, possibly like dry mouth. There's a lot of manifestations of stress that might differ based upon the person that you're talking about. Personally, I get a little bit of a dry mouth when I'm stressed, which is a good cue to take a drink. Okay, so let's transition now to why we're all here, which is exercise. Okay, so I mentioned the word stress multiple times already. Often stress, or a form of stress, is what stimulates the release of a hormone. Now, that's not always the case, but in some of the key ones, specifically the ones that we're going to talk about today, that's going to be the case. Okay, and although there are many forms of stress, often the response of the body is the same regardless of the type of stress. Okay, so emotional stress, physical stress, psychological distress, injury could be a stressor. Your body's going to respond in a similar fashion regardless of those. Okay, now there might be some subtle variations, and that's what we're going to hit on. Particularly the type of physiological stress that resistance training places on our body, right? So resistance training, weightlifting, is a very powerful physical stress. And when that physical stress is placed on our body, the endocrine system is stimulated in various glands to release these hormones to help us acutely battle the stress, which means deal with it right at that moment. Okay, so the elevation in heart rate is a good example of that. But then also there's a chronic response, which is the phrase that we use to talk about adaptations, right? Sort of the whole reason why we adapt to exercise is because our body hates stress. So if I place this stress on my body consistently, okay, my body is going to make changes to increase the strength of my body to make sure the next time I encounter that stressor, it's not going to be as disruptive to homeostasis, which we remember is the stable internal environment that our body loves, okay? So imagine if I have never went running in my life. The first time I go running, 1 mile even, my body is going to be thrown into disarray, right? Disruption, depletion of fuel, accumulation of lactic acid, depletion of oxygen, accumulation of CO2. The body hates that, okay? There's going to be an acute endocrine response while I'm running that mile to help me sort of mitigate what's happening. Heart rate's up, respiration's up. It's going to help me deal with all this CO2, etc. Now, if I keep doing that, if I keep applying that stress to my body, running a mile, there's going to be chronic changes that occur that are going to strengthen my body and to make it easier for my body to handle running 1 mile. And those are what we call adaptations, right? We adapt to exercise to make sure that activity that I do does not disrupt homeostasis as much as it did the first, second, or third time I did it, okay? So back to our slide then. With regards to resistance training, what has been found is that as little as 1 or 2 heavy resistance exercise sessions can bring about a very powerful endocrine system chronic response, okay? Often the intensity of the exercise is going to sort of elevate the response. If I do low intensity exercise, there's going to be a response, a smaller one, where if I do intense exercise, the response is going to grow proportional to the intensity of my activity. So with regards to resistance training in particular, of course, one way that we could combat this disruption of homeostasis is to get stronger, okay? And one way that we can do that is putting on more muscle mass, right? So a lot of the hormones that we'll see here shortly, one thing they're going to promote or increase the rate of is muscle hypertrophy. Hypertrophy meaning the increase in the cross-sectional area of a muscle brought about by increasing the amount of contractile protein contained within that muscle, right? So the first time I try to lift something, it might be so heavy that it's difficult for me to do it and it's disruptive to my body. But by packing in more contractile protein, if I keep lifting that same item, it becomes easier for me to lift it and therefore less disruptive to my body, okay? So hormones, again, will drive and sort of stimulate or facilitate, which means make it easier to occur, facilitate this process for muscle protein synthesis to increase in rate and overall amount, and that will minimize the effects of that stressor that I encountered earlier, okay? There are some neural adaptations which also will help make us stronger that can be augmented by the endocrine system as well. But primarily, I think that the focus mainly are on the structural changes that occur in a muscle versus the neural adaptations that occur. So before we get to the muscular adaptations, endocrine system can also adapt, right? The more you're exposed to the stress, the better your body's going to be able, the better your body's going to be at like responding to it. Okay, think about like a group of firefighters. If you had a group of new firefighters, the first time they go to put the fire out, they're not going to be as good at it, right? But if they have responded to multiple fires, every time they are exposed to that situation, they're going to be better at putting that fire out. The endocrine system kind of functions in the same way. So the first time I stress my body out through exercise, my body's not going to really know how to deal with it very well. But if I keep exposing my body to that stressor, my body's going to be better at responding to it and minimizing the disruption. Okay, so there is a list of bullet points here that kind of show you the ways that the endocrine system improves or adapts in response to chronic stress. So more hormones are produced and stored. It's easier for hormones to be removed from the body. More receptors are produced and sort of plugged in to the tissues. So there's a greater opportunity for the hormones to interact with the cells. Okay. And that kind of has a magnitude on the fourth and fifth bullet points as well. More receptors allow for greater interaction with the cell nucleus. Okay. And then also, if there are more receptors available, we don't have to release as much of the hormone because we sort of get more bang for our buck, to put it simply. Okay, so let's talk about a few specific hormones. First, we're going to start with testosterone. So as I mentioned earlier, testosterone is very responsive to high intensity stuff. So as little as 1 to 2 repetitions done at a heavy intensity can increase the number of receptors for testosterone within a cell. Okay, so that's important because no matter how much hormone is released, if there are not enough receptors for the hormone to bind to, then all that hormone that we release doesn't matter. Excuse me. But if we have more receptors available, then there's greater opportunity for that hormone to interact and bring about its change. Okay, so a lot of scientists think that that's actually the major effect that strength training has with regards to testosterone, is not that it increases the amount of the hormone, but that it increases the number of receptors available, allowing then testosterone to do its thing. Okay. Again, the effect has not been fully elucidated, and what that means is the jury is still out on exactly how and why this happens. It's just been noted that it happens. It's just not fully understood why. Okay. As far as the variables that we want to consider, again, intensity seems to be a very important variable. So the greater the intensity of the lift, the greater this impact will be with regards to testosterone and the receptors. We want to use large muscle groups. So the more muscle mass we activate during that lift, the greater the higher the magnitude will be for testosterone receptor increase. Okay, so exercises like the deadlift and the squat, even the bench press to a lesser extent, but multi-joint, large muscle group exercises, those are going to be the ones that have the largest impact on testosterone. Okay, I've heard this conventional wisdom from coaches in my life that if somebody wants to get bigger, they want to gain muscle mass, they have to do the big lifts. And by big lifts, we mean deadlift, squat, and bench. Okay, because something about activating all of that muscle mass really drives the endocrine system to increase the effect that testosterone has. Okay, heavy resistance we mentioned, moderate to high volume. So what that basically means is the number of overall reps or sets that you would do. Often that's proportional as well. So the greater the volume, or the more reps you do overall in a workout or throughout the course of a week, the greater the response is going to be. And that's another way to put that, is you're increasing the stress, right? Low volume is a lower stressor. Higher volume is a higher stressor. Usually the higher the stressor, the greater the stressor is, the greater the response will be from the endocrine system. Rest periods kind of work in an inverse. So a shorter rest period is actually more stressful, right? Longer recovery would reduce the overall impact of stress. Shorter recovery would increase the overall impact of the stressor. So shorter rest intervals will bring about a larger response from the endocrine system. Lastly, then, this is an interesting one, is that, there's a learned effect. This kind of goes back to the analogy I made about the firefighters, right? The more experienced you are, the easier it's going to be for your body to put out that fire, to kind of go back and forth between my analogies. When you're a novice, your body's not going to be as efficient at responding to the stress, but the more experienced you are, your body's going to become more experienced at responding to that stress. It's kind of like riding a bike, right? The first time you ride a bike, you fall over, you're all over the road, but the more you ride that bike, you become more efficient at riding that bike. Same idea with response to endocrine response to training. So here we just show, some key differences with regards to what is known as free testosterone. Free testosterone is what is actually available to bind with the receptors. We have some testosterone in our bodies that is bound to this molecule known as sex hormone binding globulin. When the testosterone is bound to this molecule, it cannot bind to the receptors. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, if all of your testosterone is bound to this globulin, it really can't do anything for you. Okay? Only the free testosterone can bind to the receptors. Okay? So again, some of these mechanisms that we saw on this last slide, they can increase the amount of free testosterone that we have available, which is going to be an important factor. Okay? It's kind of hypothesized that people who don't train, their testosterone concentrations may be similar overall to people who do train, but the people who train, they have more free testosterone than the people who don't train, which means that testosterone can bind to the receptors and bring about the changes. Okay, so yeah, heavy resistance can do that. It does note here that women typically have lower testosterone concentrations than males. And we see that here on a 15 to 20-fold lower circulating testosterone than men. Now, again, that's on average. A woman could have higher testosterone than a man. If you took any two given individuals from the population, the woman may have higher testosterone, but on average, women have much lower testosterone concentrations than men, and that's largely due to our biology, right? Men have certain sex organs, women have certain sex organs. The male sex organs are more, adept at producing testosterone. That's kind of one of their major roles. Okay. Last thing on testosterone here. This last bullet point kind of illustrates what I said a second ago, that if you took any two given individuals from the population, a female may have higher than the male. And that's because there could be a pretty substantial variation or differentiation between individual women, where some may have higher testosterone concentrations than others. Okay. So let's transition to the next hormone, which is growth hormone. Now, this hormone has a great deal of importance, but it's actually very poorly understood, which is kind of shocking to me, actually. When I research this, often you see repeated in like books and stuff, the effects are largely unknown, which I find kind of odd, but because you'd think by now we would have more information about it. But there's still a lot that's known. Okay, so first of all, growth hormone concentrations are typically highest concentrations in our bodies when we're children, okay, because growth hormone is the primary thing that causes the growth of the overall organism. So bones lengthen, tissues grow in size, bones thicken, etc. When growth hormone is in high concentrations. Growth hormone often follows like a pulsatile release which means it's not always stimulated by stress, although it is. It also is often released at night, okay? So when we're sleeping, growth hormone is released, and that promotes growth of the various tissues while we're asleep, okay? And that largely, again, occurs during childhood, okay? Now, if you look at all of these different things that growth hormone can do, right? So a positive means it's stimulating, a negative means it's an inhibitory effect, so it can do both. Stimulates the mobilization of fat. That would be more of an acute response. Okay, so I mentioned earlier, hormones have both acute responses and chronic responses. Chronic responses are more related to adaptation. Acute is more managing the stressor while it's happening. Okay, so this one, mobilizing fat from storage, is an acute response, which allows us to have fuel to use during exercise. Okay. Then down here, this is going to be more of a chronic response. Okay, so stimulates muscle protein synthesis. That's adaptation. Over here, it's going to stimulate bone growth. That is an adaptation. Down here, it's going to stimulate the release of insulin-like growth factors. That is an adaptation as well. A lot of these insulin-like growth factors are sort of like proto-hormones that stimulate the growth of individual tissues, and they are a factor with regards to increasing muscle hypertrophy. Okay. Over here, we see an inhibitory effect, and that is going to be on immune function, which is interesting. Okay. Now, often when we're exercising, immune function is decreased, okay, because of the effect of growth hormone being released, but also then cortisol, as we'll see, also inhibits the immune system. Cortisol is released during exercise. So while exercising long-term can elevate immunity, right, while we're exercising, our immunity is actually reduced. That's one reason why it's not a good idea to exercise when you're sick, because you're just going to further lessen your immunity, which could potentially lead to the condition getting worse. Okay. Long term, though, regular exercise boosts immune function, but while we're exercising, immune system is diminished. One reason is because of the effect of growth hormone here. Now, what you see here is some modifying factors for the concentration of growth hormone. Stress, we just mentioned. When we're stressed, it's up. Okay. Fitness levels can sort of increase growth hormone chronically, slightly. Growth hormones tends to decrease with age. Adiposity, or having a lot of adipose tissue, can decrease it. Exercise can increase it. Often when we're injured, we have elevated growth hormone concentrations as that tissue is attempting to be repaired. Gender, there's not really a big difference, honestly. It's pretty similar between males and females. What affects the difference are these other factors that we mentioned here, okay? And then again, this is a bullet point list of some of the things that I just went through. Did we miss anything? I think we hit all of these, actually. Collagen synthesis would be sort of related to the bone issue, where bones and the connective tissues that attach the muscle to the bone, they tend to be stimulated to grow when growth hormone concentration is elevated. Now, one thing we didn't mention is decreased glucose utilization. So when growth hormone is high, it's stimulated, we spare glucose, which means we don't use it. And instead, we use something else, which is why lipolysis, or the release of fat, increases, right? When growth hormone concentrations are high, we tend to favor the utilization of fat rather than glucose, okay? Now, interestingly, the thing that we might think we would know the most about, which is the protein synthesis, is actually what we know the least about, okay? It's hypothesized that growth hormone does not directly stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Instead, it does it indirectly by using these insulin-like growth factors. So growth hormone stimulates the liver to release the IGF, insulin-like growth factor, and that IGF is what then stimulates an increased muscle protein synthesis. So it's more of an indirect stimulation via sort of a middleman versus a direct stimulation. Training adaptations. I mentioned earlier, hormones are slow acting, which makes them difficult to measure because growth hormone is released slowly over a long period of time. That could be one reason why there's not a lot of research that shows the acute effect growth hormone has after a workout session, because it's released over such a slow period of time. Okay, and also it's released in that pulsatile fashion, like I mentioned earlier. Like when we're sleeping, it's going to be released in that burst, relax, burst, relax. So, thinking about insulin-like growth factor then. So I mentioned insulin-like growth factor, and again, just to see where that fits into the puzzle here. It's released from the liver. It's not a pure classic hormone that you might think of. I think of it as more of a sort of a combination hormone. Insulin and growth hormone sort of combine into this additional hormone that we call insulin-like growth factor, or IGF-1. So it's been found that IGF is actually one of the primary things that directly stimulates muscle protein synthesis. Okay. And as we've seen, it is going to be stimulated directly by heavy resistance training. Okay. However, it's also been found that there is a nutritional stimulation of IGF as well. Okay. So in general, sort of a protein, carbohydrate combined food item or beverage during the post-workout phase can increase IGF, but in particular, it's not mentioned on the slide here, but I just know this from my past studies, that the amino acid leucine, which is a branched chain amino acid, can actually also directly stimulate IGF-1 as well. Okay, so as we saw back when we were looking at the growth hormone slide, there are different things that can stimulate hormones. So in this particular case, the stress of exercise, but also there's a dietary impact on the hormone as well. Okay. Now let's jump to the next important hormone, and that is going to be cortisol. So cortisol would be classified as an adrenal hormone because it's released from the adrenal gland, which is down on top of the kidney. So we see a few of its major effects, and notice that its effects are known as catabolic. Okay, catabolic, remember, means tearing things down. So one thing that it breaks down is muscle protein. So not great while we're exercising, but again, if we can pull cortisol down after the workout, it's not that big of a deal. Okay. The reason why it does that is it wants to make sure we have fuel to perform the activity. So it could stimulate the tear down of proteins, breaking them down into amino acids, and then convert those amino acids into glucose, which we can then use to fuel the activity that we're doing. Okay. It also makes sense that as it's tearing protein down, it would also inhibit the synthesis of new protein. Okay. And it, again, may also have the effect of suppressing immune cell function. So these are all negative things, there's no way around it. But during exercise, it's not that big of a deal. The problem lies in if cortisol levels are chronically high, okay? And what would make that happen? Well, very high amounts of life stress, okay? Again, your body's going to respond to stress regardless of the type of stress that it is. So if you're always stressed out about things, your cortisol levels are going to be elevated and you're going to be experiencing higher levels of these 4 bullet points here, which can be negative, right? Especially if you want to be healthy and not be sick, and also if you want to gain some muscle mass, become more athletic, etc. Okay. So as far as its response to exercise, it doesn't change a ton other than the overall amount of cortisol is going to be lessened, right? And that really is kind of related to your body's overall response to stress. If you're used to doing an activity, your body's not going to be as stressed out by that activity, so the release of cortisol would be lessened. Okay, so once you become habitually trained, cortisol levels will not be as high as they were for the activity the first few times that you did it. Okay, so that's an adaptation to stress. Now, another set of adrenal hormones are known as the catecholamines, and these are 2 separate hormones known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. So to jump back, the cortisol is a slow-acting hormone. It's released into the blood. The catecholamines are fast-acting hormones. And they also are known as like a neurotransmitter, which means they're released very rapidly, sort of within cells, okay? And they can travel in the blood, but they interact very rapidly, okay? These are more the things that get us ready for immediate action. So if we take a look at this checklist here, force production is increased when our adrenal hormone concentrations are high. Muscle contraction rate, which means the rate that we produce force, is increased. Blood pressure is increased. That's going to make sure that we get oxygenated blood to tissues faster. Energy availability is increased, so more glucose is mobilized from storage, fats are mobilized from storage, and they're available to be used by cells that need them. We're going to increase blood flow to muscle. Again, that's going to have the effect of getting oxygen-rich blood to the muscles that are active at that given time. Okay, and then also it could facilitate the increased secretion of other hormones such as testosterone. So when our stress levels are high, resulting in increased adrenaline release, that's going to boost testosterone release as well. Okay. So as far as adaptations go, it's going to fit a similar pattern that when we're training, we adapt by having an ability to secrete a greater amount of these hormones, which is good because if we take a look at this list again, this really equips us probably more than anything that we've seen to do the task at hand. So when we're exercising, when we're doing it, these hormones here are the ones that give us the biggest assistance in being able to perform the task. The others that we've seen are more slower acting, more related to adaptation. These particular ones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, which we could kind of group in and generally call adrenaline. That's a more common term. These are the things that allow us to get the task done, okay? The others are more worried about, well, what happens after the task is over? Recovery. So some others that we're not going to spend a lot of time on, they're not as intimately involved during exercise, but maybe in the recovery period. I think insulin, we could spend a second to talk about. Insulin, it's good for insulin to be elevated after exercise because insulin encourages the storage of nutrients into cells. After we exercise, nutrient levels in cells can be reduced, so it's going to be a good thing to get nutrients into the cells. Insulin promotes that. So consuming some carbohydrate after a workout can help provoke an insulin response, and that would then drive those nutrients you consume in the recovery nutrition, get them into the cells, so you start providing the raw materials for your body to start repairing itself and adapting to the exercise. So that's going to wrap it up. I know that was sort of a rapid and a little bit of a choppy lecture. The endocrine system is complicated, right? And there's still a lot that we don't know about it with regards to its function, the exact effects it can have. As I indicated in this lecture, there's a lot of different stressors that can sort of come into play to modify the endocrine response. And I think that's what makes it difficult to really kind of pin down and say, this is how it happens, because there are so many influences on it. You know, literally everything that we experience in life at any given moment is having an effect on your endocrine system. So that makes it difficult to pin down. Okay, we did our best. I would say if we had to recap with regards to exercise, intensity is a really important factor, right? The higher the intensity of the activity, the greater the endocrine response will be. And typically that means the adaptations will be more magnified as well. During exercise, adrenaline has the biggest impact. The others have more of an impact in the recovery, okay? Another key thing that we saw was a lot of the different hormones, growth hormone included, their roles are to get fuel into our bloodstream, okay? At rest, we have fuel, fat and glucose mainly, stored in our cells in different places, stored in our liver, stored in muscles, stored in our fat tissue. During exercise, we want that fuel to be mobilized and enter the bloodstream where hungry muscles can pull it out of the blood and use it to create ATP, okay? So hormones, growth hormone, the catecholamines, even cortisol, their main role is to mobilize fuel to allow us to make sure we have the fuel available to make ATP. Other hormones such as testosterone, IGF, their main role is increasing protein synthesis. So we kind of see really two purposes, right? Fuel mobilization on the one hand, protein synthesis on the other hand. Those are kind of the most important functions that the endocrine system serves with regards to adaptation to exercise, in particular to strength training. Okay, so that's my recap. Tasks are similar to what we've seen so far. I have 5 lecture study questions based upon what we talked about, and then a critical thinking assignment asking you to look at a particular hormone excuse me, and how it might be impacted during exercise. Okay, so that's it for this week. I'll come back and see you all next week when we're going to start talking more about exercise more specifically and different training adaptations. So I think that if you were a little bit uninterested with this initial unit, I get it, I understand. This is sort of just kind of reviewing the body systems again. We're going to get into more of the training aspect of things starting next week, and I'll come back and see you all then. Take care.